The gavel comes down so hard the sound cracks through the courtroom like a rifle shot. "I said sit down," Judge Walter Briggs snaps, his voice thick with contempt. "You people always think you can walk in here like you own the place." Every head in the gallery turns. A woman stands at the defense table, back straight, hands folded in front of her. She is 54 years old, dressed in a plain navy blazer that has seen better winters, a modest leather folder tucked under one arm. She does not flinch. She does not sit down. "Your Honor," she says quietly, "I have a right to be heard." "You have the right to be held in contempt," Briggs fires back, leaning forward over the bench like a man who has never once been told no. "Bailiff, escort her out." The bailiff hesitates. Something about the woman's stillness makes him pause, the way a man pauses before stepping onto ice he isn't sure will hold. The woman looks up at Judge Briggs. Her expression does not change. She simply says, in a voice so calm it is almost gentle, "You should probably get my name right for the record, Your Honor. You're going to be saying it a lot in the coming weeks." Judge Briggs laughs, a short, ugly bark of a laugh, the kind of laugh a man makes when he has never once paid for his own arrogance. He has no idea who just walked into his courtroom. Her name is Denise Whitfield. She grew up in a two-bedroom house in Macon, Georgia, the fourth of 5 children, raised by a mother who cleaned office buildings at night and a father who drove a delivery truck until his knees gave out. There were nights the lights got shut off, and her mother would light a candle at the kitchen table and tell all 5 kids that this was temporary, that none of them were going to stay in that kitchen forever. Denise believed her. She was the first person in her family to finish college. She paid her way through law school by working the overnight shift at a diner in Athens, Georgia, memorizing case law between orders of hash browns and black coffee, catching 2 or 3 hours of sleep before her morning classes. She has been practicing law for 29 years. She started out in a legal aid clinic representing tenants facing eviction for repairs their landlords refused to make. She has argued in front of the Georgia Supreme Court 4 times. She has represented sharecroppers' descendants in decades-long land disputes, whistleblowers in corporate fraud cases, and more than anything, ordinary people the system was never built to protect. She built a reputation slowly, case by case, not for being flashy but for being right and for never letting an opposing counsel rattle her. She does not raise her voice. She has never needed to. People who meet Denise for the first time often make the same mistake. They see a quiet, unassuming woman in sensible shoes, driving a 12-year-old sedan with a cracked side mirror, carrying a scuffed leather folder instead of a designer briefcase, and they assume there is nothing more to her than what is on the surface. Younger attorneys sometimes mistake her for a paralegal. Court staff sometimes mistake her for a family member waiting on a hearing. Judges, more often than she would like to admit, mistake her for someone who does not know how the system works. They are wrong every single time. Denise learned a long time ago that being underestimated was not a curse. It was a tool. People reveal who they really are when they believe no one important is watching. She has spent 3 decades learning to watch, to listen, and to wait. She has learned that the loudest man in the room is rarely the most dangerous one. The most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone stopped paying attention to. What Judge Walter Briggs does not know, what almost no one in that courtroom knows, is that Denise Whitfield is the current president of the Georgia State Bar Association. She oversees attorney licensing. She sits on the Judicial Qualifications Commission's advisory panel. She has the authority to initiate formal misconduct investigations against sitting judges. Governors have called her for advice. Law schools name scholarships after her. But today she is not wearing that title. Today she is simply Ms. Whitfield, a volunteer attorney representing a 19-year-old client named Tyrell Combs, who cannot afford a lawyer and has nowhere else to turn. She chose to take this case herself, quietly, without an entourage, without a press release. For months, the State Bar's ethics hotline has been receiving anonymous complaints about a judge in rural Ashwood County. Complaints about a man who mocks defendants, humiliates young attorneys, and treats his courtroom like a personal kingdom. Denise could have sent an investigator. She could have subpoenaed transcripts from her office in Atlanta and never left her desk. Instead, she drove 90 minutes down a 2-lane highway, past pine trees and boarded-up gas stations to see it for herself. She has learned over the years that paperwork lies. People under pressure tell the truth. A transcript can be worded carefully. A courtroom cannot hide what it truly feels like to sit in the gallery and watch someone with a gavel decide, in real time, whose dignity matters and whose does not. There is another reason, one she rarely says out loud even to Renee. 19 years ago, before she became anyone of consequence, a young Denise Whitfield sat in a courtroom much like this one, waiting for a judge to decide whether her cousin's eviction would stand. That judge never looked up from his newspaper long enough to hear a single word either of them said. Denise has never forgotten what it felt like to be invisible in a room where a stranger held all the power. She has spent every year since trying to make sure fewer people have to feel that way. The Ashwood County Courthouse sits at the center of a town that time seems to have forgotten to update. Its brick facade is stained by decades of rain. Inside, the fluorescent lights hum with a tired, flickering buzz, and the hallway smells like old paper and burnt coffee. The benches in the gallery are hard oak, worn smooth by generations of nervous hands. A ceiling fan turns lazily overhead, doing nothing against the Georgia heat. Somewhere down the hall, a baby cries. A woman in a folding chair clutches a manila folder to her chest like it's the only thing keeping her afloat. Outside, the July heat presses against the tall windows, and the courthouse's ancient air conditioning wheezes out a stream of lukewarm air that barely reaches the back rows. A security guard near the metal detector checks his phone, bored, half listening to the murmur of names being called from the docket sheet taped to the wall. A young mother bounces a fussy toddler on her knee, mouthing the words of a prayer under her breath. An elderly man in a faded Army veteran's cap sits alone, twisting a parking ticket in his hands like it might rearrange itself into something less expensive if he just held it long enough. This courtroom does not serve the wealthy. The wealthy have lawyers who settle things quietly, in offices with better lighting, over conference calls that never require anyone to sit on a hard oak bench for 6 hours waiting for their name to be called. This courtroom serves the people who have nowhere else to go, and for 22 years it has been ruled over by one man. Judge Walter Briggs is 61 years old, with silver hair combed back in a style that hasn't changed since 1998 and a permanent expression of mild disgust, as if the entire world smells faintly of something he'd rather not name. He was appointed to the bench 22 years ago and has run unopposed in every election since, not because his constituents love him, but because no one in Ashwood County has the money or the nerve to challenge him. Every 4 years, his name simply reappears on the ballot, unchallenged, and every 4 years he wins by default, mistaking the absence of an opponent for the presence of respect. Briggs grew up poor himself, the son of a mill worker in a town not unlike the one he now presides over, and something about the memory of that poverty curdled inside him over the years into contempt for anyone who reminds him of where he came from. He does not see himself in the tired, worried faces that fill his courtroom every day. He sees, instead, everything he has spent his career trying to distance himself from, and he punishes them for it without ever admitting that's what he's doing. He wears his robe like armor. He wears his gavel like a weapon. His insecurity has a specific shape. He was passed over twice for a seat on the Court of Appeals, both times by candidates he privately dismissed as unqualified. He keeps a framed rejection letter in his desk drawer, not as a reminder to do better, but as fuel for a grudge against a system he believes never gave him the credit he deserved. Every person who challenges him in his courtroom becomes, in his mind, a small proxy for every slight he has never gotten over. Clerks whisper about him in the break room. Bailiffs trade knowing looks when his name comes up. Everyone in that courthouse knows what Judge Briggs is, and everyone has learned, the hard way, that complaining about him accomplishes nothing. 3 separate complaints were filed against him in the last decade alone. All 3 were quietly reviewed by a county judicial committee stacked with his golfing partners and closed within a month, marked insufficient evidence. Diane Foss, the court clerk, still remembers typing up the closure letters, her hands shaking slightly each time, wondering what it would take for anyone to actually listen. He has been getting away with it for over 2 decades. And in all that time, he has never once had to explain himself to anyone who mattered. An hour before Denise's case is called, a young public defender named Marcus Reed stands at the same defense table, representing a client accused of a minor probation violation. Marcus is 26, a year out of law school, still paying off student loans, still believing, despite everything, that the system can work if you just do things by the book. Your Honor, if I may direct the court to the probation officer's own report. Son, Briggs interrupts, not even looking up from his papers. Did they teach you how to read a calendar in law school? Because we don't have all day for you to figure out how to talk. A few people in the gallery chuckle nervously, not because it's funny, but because laughing along with Judge Briggs is safer than staying silent. Marcus's ears go red. He presses forward anyway, quietly finishing his argument, his voice noticeably tighter than when he started. Briggs waves a hand and rules against his client without addressing a single point Marcus raised, without even glancing at the probation report sitting untouched on the bench in front of him. Next case, Briggs says, already bored, reaching for a coffee mug that reads World's OKAYSD Judge. A gag gift from a courthouse Christmas party years ago that he has somehow taken to using unironically. Marcus's client, a 19-year-old named Deshaun who has been trying, against long odds, to hold down a job and finish his probation without incident, puts his face in his hands. He knows what the ruling means. It means the violation stands. It means his probation officer will be watching him even more closely now, for a mistake that was never really his to begin with. Marcus gathers his papers with shaking hands and sits down in the front row, humiliated in front of a room full of strangers. Denise, sitting 3 rows back in a plain wooden pew, watches all of it. She watches the way Briggs never once looks Marcus in the eye. She watches the way the room goes quiet in a way that isn't respectful, it's afraid. She takes out a small spiral notebook and writes something down. She does not say a word, not yet. Case number 24 CR 1187, State versus Tyrell Combs. Denise rises and walks to the defense table. She sets her worn leather folder down with quiet precision. Judge Briggs looks at her for the first time, really looks at her, and something in his face shifts into open irritation. He sees a middle-aged black woman in an unremarkable blazer, and in the half-second it takes him to form a judgment, he has already decided who she is. And you are? Denise Whitfield, Your Honor, counsel for the defendant. Briggs snorts, counsel. He says the word like it's a joke he's already heard before. You sure about that? You look like you wandered in from the waiting room. A ripple of uncomfortable laughter moves through the gallery. Denise does not react. She opens her folder. Your Honor, my client's public defender filed for a continuance that was never entered into the docket. I have the filing here, along with the certified mail receipt showing it was received by this court 11 days ago. She places the documents on the clerk's desk, her hands steady. Under Georgia Code Section 17A33, a continuance request properly filed and unopposed should have been addressed before this matter was calendared for trial. My client was never notified of a hearing date. He learned about today's court date from a neighbor 2 days ago. Briggs flips through the papers without really reading them. This looks like a whole lot of nothing to me. With respect, Your Honor, the certified mail receipt is dated and signed by a clerk of this court. I'd ask that the record reflect that this filing was received and not acted upon. I don't need a lecture on my own courtroom, Ms. He glances at his notes, Whitfield. I'm not lecturing, Your Honor. I'm asking the court to follow its own procedure. The room goes very quiet. Something about her calm seems to enrage him more than any argument could have. You people come in here, Briggs says, his voice rising, with your little folders and your little Xerox papers, thinking you can tell me how to run my courtroom. I have been a judge for 22 years. I don't need some paralegal from a strip mall law office lecturing me on procedure. He gestures broadly at the gallery, playing to an audience that is, in truth, too frightened to enjoy the performance. You know, in my day, people showed a little respect when they walked into a courtroom. Nowadays, everybody's got an opinion, everybody's got a Xerox machine and a chip on their shoulder. I'm not a paralegal, Your Honor. I'm an attorney licensed in the state of Georgia for 29 years. Is that right? Briggs leans back, folding his arms, a cruel smile spreading across his face. Well, 29 years and you still don't know how to keep your mouth shut when a judge is talking. Bailiff, if Ms. Whitfield says one more word out of turn, you can escort her to a holding cell and we'll discuss contempt charges. A woman in the gallery gasps softly. Marcus Reed, still nursing his own humiliation from an hour earlier, turns pale watching it happen to someone else. Denise's expression does not change. She folds her hands. Understood, Your Honor. Briggs, satisfied that he has won, waves dismissively toward the clerk. Enter the continuance as denied. We'll proceed today. Denise turns to the court clerk, her tone still even, still polite. Could I get a certified copy of today's docket entry, please, and the case number for the record? The clerk, a woman named Diane Foss who has worked in this courthouse for 11 years, glances nervously toward the bench before nodding. Of course, ma'am. And is this proceeding being recorded? I'd like to request the audio transcript be preserved along with the timestamp. Briggs's eyes narrow slightly. Why would you need that? For my records, Your Honor, Denise says simply. Standard practice. He waves a hand, already losing interest, already certain he has put this woman in her place. He has no idea that every word he has said in the last 4 minutes has just been logged into an official court record that he cannot make disappear. Denise gathers her folder. She does not argue further. She does not raise her voice. She simply nods once to the bench. Thank you for your time, Your Honor. She turns and walks toward the exit, her heels clicking evenly against the tile floor. At the door, she pauses just for a moment and looks back at Judge Briggs, who is already on to the next case, already certain the matter is closed. Your Honor, she says, just loud enough to be heard, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week. I suspect it may be one of your last quiet ones for a while. She walks out before he can respond. Briggs blinks, unsettled for the first time all day, then shakes it off with a scoff. Some people, he mutters, and moves on to case number 24 CR 1188. Denise sits in her car in the courthouse parking lot for exactly 4 minutes before she picks up her phone. Renee, it's me, she says. I need you to pull every complaint filed against Judge Walter Briggs in Ashwood County going back 10 years, everyone. I don't care how minor it looked at the time. On the other end, her chief of staff, Renee Marsh, doesn't ask questions. She has worked for Denise long enough to know that when her boss uses that particular tone, flat, unhurried, absolutely certain, something significant is about to happen. I also need you to call Tom Yude, Denise continues. Tell him I have a new case for the commission. And Renee, I want the court reporter's audio from case 24 CR 1187 in Ashwood County and the audio from the case right before it. There's a young public defender named Marcus Reed. Find out how to reach him. You want me to open a formal file. Denise glances back at the courthouse in her rearview mirror, its tired brick walls baking in the afternoon sun. Open the file, she says. And Renee, reach out to the planning committee for the Georgia Bar's Judicial Excellence Gala next month. I understand Judge Briggs has been nominated for an award. There is a pause on the line. You're going to let him accept it? I'm going to let him think he's going to. Word spreads through the Ashwood County Courthouse that Judge Walter Briggs has been nominated for the Georgia Bar Association's Judicial Excellence Award, a career honor recognizing exceptional service and integrity on the bench. Briggs struts through the courthouse hallway like a man who has already accepted the trophy. He brags to the clerks. He tells the bailiffs he always knew this day would come. 22 years, he tells anyone who will listen, and they finally recognize real leadership, not like these young judges who let defendants walk all over them. He does not know that Tom Eude, a retired judicial conduct investigator now working for the state bar, has spent 3 weeks quietly building a file that includes 14 sworn complaints, 6 hours of court audio, and 24 witness statements, including one from a shaken but determined Marcus Reed, and another from the woman Briggs once threatened with contempt for asking too many questions about her disabled son's guardianship hearing. He does not know that Diane Foss, the court clerk, finally worked up the courage to hand over 11 years of internal memos documenting complaints that were filed and quietly buried. He does not know any of it. He only knows that in 1 week, he will stand on a stage in Atlanta and be celebrated as a pillar of the legal community. The grand ballroom of the Atlanta Marriott Marquis glitters with chandeliers and white linen tablecloths. Georgia's legal elite fill the room: judges, senior partners, state legislators, a scattering of reporters near the back with notepads and cameras. Judge Walter Briggs arrives in a rented tuxedo that fits a little too snugly, beaming, shaking hands, accepting compliments before he has even received the award. "Big night, Judge Briggs," a colleague says, clapping him on the back. "Well deserved." "Damn right it is," Briggs replies with a grin, adjusting his bow tie. 22 years of holding the line. Somebody's got to keep order in these courtrooms. People these days want to argue with everything. He tells a table of junior associates a story about a defendant who once tried to argue with him over a parking violation, laughing loudly at his own punchline, not noticing that the associates are laughing a half-second too late, out of politeness rather than genuine amusement. He orders a second scotch. He tells the waiter, only half joking, to keep his award seat close by so the photographers can get his good side. He does not notice the woman near the stage in the deep emerald dress, standing quietly beside the podium, reviewing a folder of notes with the same calm, unhurried focus she had in a rundown county courtroom 3 weeks earlier. The MC steps to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the president of the Georgia State Bar Association, Denise Whitfield." Applause fills the room. Denise walks to the podium with the same measured, unhurried steps she has always had, except now, under the chandelier light, in front of 500 of the state's most powerful legal minds. There is no mistaking who she is. Judge Briggs, seated at a table near the front, goes very still. His fork stops halfway to his mouth. His face drains of color, the way a man's face drains when he suddenly understands, with total and horrifying clarity, that the ground beneath him has been quietly removed while he wasn't looking. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Denise begins, her voice calm and clear across the ballroom. "Every year we gather to celebrate the people who uphold the integrity of our courts. Tonight, before we present this year's award, I'd like to share a story." She does not look at Briggs, not yet. 3 weeks ago, I sat in the gallery of a small county courtroom and watched a 26-year-old public defender named Marcus Reed try to do his job. He cited the record. He raised a valid legal argument. And he was mocked, interrupted, and dismissed by the presiding judge before he ever finished a sentence. A murmur moves through the crowd. An hour later, I stood at that same defense table, representing a 19-year-old client who had never even been properly notified of his own court date. When I raised that issue respectfully with documentation, I was told, and I quote from the certified court transcript, that I looked like I wandered in from the waiting room. I was threatened with contempt. I was told, quote, "You people come into his courtroom with little Xerox papers." She lets the words hang in the air. That judge did not know who I was. He assumed, based entirely on my appearance, that I was uneducated, unqualified, and powerless. He was wrong about all three. But more importantly, he was wrong to treat anyone that way, whether they happen to be the president of the state bar or not. Every head in the ballroom slowly turns toward Judge Walter Briggs's table. He sits frozen, his rented tuxedo suddenly feeling 3 sizes too tight, sweat beading along his hairline. The colleagues who clapped him on the back an hour ago now stare at him, with expressions shifting from confusion to disbelief to open disgust. "In the past 3 weeks," Denise continues, "our office has received and verified 14 separate misconduct complaints against this judge, spanning 11 years. We have obtained court audio confirming a consistent pattern of demeaning, discriminatory, and abusive conduct toward litigants, public defenders, and members of this bar, particularly toward women and people of color who appeared before him." A reporter near the back is already typing furiously. "We have statements from court staff who were instructed, repeatedly, to keep these complaints from ever reaching the Judicial Qualifications Commission. We have a signed record from a young public defender named Marcus Reed, who is here with us tonight, and who has agreed to share what happened to him in that courtroom 3 weeks ago. Marcus Reed, seated at a table near the side of the room, rises slowly, his hands trembling but his chin lifted. I almost left this profession because of what happened in that courtroom, he says, his voice carrying across the silent ballroom. I thought that was just how it was going to be for the rest of my career. I thought no one was ever going to care enough to do anything about it. He sits back down. No one in the room says a word. Even the servers near the kitchen doors have stopped moving, standing frozen with trays of untouched dessert. Denise lets the silence stretch a moment longer before continuing. This is not about one bad day or one bad temper. This is about a pattern of conduct that this profession allowed to continue for 22 years because it was easier to look away than to hold a powerful man accountable. Tonight, we stop looking away. Judge Briggs stands up so fast his chair scrapes loudly against the floor. This is a setup, he stammers, his voice cracking, all his usual bluster gone. You can't just ambush a man at his own award ceremony. You're not receiving an award tonight, Judge Briggs, Denise says evenly without raising her voice. As of this morning, the Judicial Qualifications Commission has voted to formally suspend you, pending a full investigation into your conduct, effective immediately. Gasps ripple through the ballroom. A state senator at a nearby table shakes his head slowly. A senior partner mutters something under his breath and looks away, visibly embarrassed to have shaken Briggs's hand earlier. You can't do this, Briggs sputters, looking around wildly for support that no longer exists. 22 years, I've given this state 22 years. You were given 22 years of trust, Denise replies, and you spent it teaching people that this profession doesn't care about them unless they can fight back. Tonight, we're telling you and every judge in this room that it does. The applause that follows is not for Briggs. It rises slowly, then swells, directed instead at Denise, at Marcus, at every quiet act of courage it took to get to this moment. Briggs stands alone at his table as the people around him physically shift their chairs away, no one willing to be photographed anywhere near him. The fallout is swift. Within 72 hours, Judge Walter Briggs is formally suspended without pay pending the commission's investigation. Local and statewide news outlets pick up the story. A front-page piece runs on the pattern of complaints buried for over a decade, complete with excerpts from the court audio that leave little room for interpretation. Two former defendants, emboldened by the story, come forward with their own accounts. One describes being threatened with jail time for asking to reschedule a hearing around a chemotherapy appointment. A civil rights attorney files a motion to reopen 12 cases where Briggs's rulings are now in serious question. The state bar's disciplinary board recommends his removal from the bench and the revocation of his judicial pension. Briggs hires an attorney of his own, a sharp-suited man from Atlanta who tries in a closed-door hearing to argue that his client's comments were colorful, not discriminatory, and that 22 years of service should count for something. The commission is unmoved. The recordings speak louder than any defense he can mount. Within 2 months, facing near-certain removal, Briggs resigns. He never presides over another case. He is seen, weeks later, buying groceries alone at a supermarket in a neighboring county, wearing a baseball cap pulled low, avoiding eye contact with anyone who might recognize his face from the news. The rented tuxedo, it turns out, was the last thing he ever wore in front of a room that respected him. Marcus Reed's client, the young man whose case was dismissed with a shrug that afternoon in Ashwood County, has his conviction vacated on appeal. Marcus himself is offered a position with the state bar's newly expanded Judicial Accountability Unit, a role created directly as a result of what happened that day. I almost quit law altogether after that hearing, Marcus tells Denise months later in her office in Atlanta. I thought that was just how it was going to be. I thought no one with any power was ever going to care. Denise looks at him steadily. Someone was always watching, Marcus. It just took time for the watching to turn into something that could actually change things. Diane Foss, the court clerk who finally handed over 11 years of buried complaints, is later commended by the commission for her courage and helps train new court staff on how to properly document misconduct without fear of retaliation. She keeps a small note on her desk now, one she wrote to herself the week the investigation opened. You don't have to be powerful to be brave. You just have to go first. Tyrell Combs, the 19-year-old whose improperly noticed hearing started the entire chain of events, finishes his case with the charges dismissed. He later writes Denise a short, awkward letter thanking her, not for winning his case, he says, but for being the first adult in a courtroom who ever spoke to him like he mattered. Months later, Denise sits in her modest office, the same worn leather folder resting on the corner of her desk. Her 12-year-old sedan is still parked in the same spot outside, cracked mirror and all. She has not changed. She never intended to. A new case file sits open in front of her, another anonymous complaint, this time from a courthouse 2 counties over. Renee pokes her head in. Another road trip. Denise closes the folder, a small, quiet smile crossing her face. Someone has to go see for themselves. She does not do this work for applause. She does not do it for headlines. She does it because she remembers what it felt like to be underestimated, and she has spent a lifetime making sure that feeling never has the final word. Outside her window, the Atlanta skyline catches the last light of the afternoon, and somewhere out there, in a courthouse no one is watching closely enough, another version of this story is quietly beginning. Another clerk is deciding whether to speak up. Another young attorney is being told to sit down and stay quiet. Another ordinary-looking person is walking through a metal detector, carrying more than anyone in that building could possibly guess. Denise slides Tyrell's letter into a drawer she keeps for the ones that matter most, picks up the new case file and gets back to work. Power, real power, is rarely loud. It does not need to announce itself, threaten, or demand respect. The people who abuse their authority almost always mistake silence for weakness and humility for ignorance, and it is precisely that mistake that destroys them. Judge Walter Briggs spent 22 years judging people by what they wore, how they spoke, and what he assumed they could not do to him. He never once stopped to consider that the very people he dismissed might be the ones holding the truth that would end him. Respect costs nothing, cruelty eventually costs everything. The next time you find yourself sitting across from someone who seems unremarkable, someone quiet, someone plainly dressed, someone easy to dismiss, remember Judge Walter Briggs and remember that you very rarely know the whole story of the person in front of you. Treat them well anyway. Not because you're afraid of who they might turn out to be, but because it's who you should be no matter who they are. If you believe people in power should be held accountable, no matter how many years they've hidden behind that power, hit the like button, subscribe for more stories like this one, and tell me in the comments, what would you have done in that courtroom?